Hey everybody, welcome to the Blendr Report, where news meets rational thinking. I'm your host, Jonathan Harvey. This is your co-host, Liam DeBoer. Liam, what are we talking about today?
Today, we're going to be chatting about the RCMP and CSIS failing to justify Trudeau's use of the Emergencies Act, Trump's chaotic on-again, off-again tariff strategy, Phase 1 of the Epstein files being released, the mass exodus of Liberals with over 30 MPs jumping ship, the globalist web behind Mark Carney's rise, and Machiavelli's concept of whether fear or love is a better tool for leaders. All right, let's get started. So first off, we've got RCMP and CSIS failed to justify Trudeau's Emergencies Act crackdown. Testimony from RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lucki and CSIS Director David Vigneault has dismantled the Trudeau government's justification for invoking the Emergencies Act. CSIS never deemed the Freedom Convoy a national security threat, and the RCMP never requested emergency powers, contradicting the government's claims. Border blockades were cleared using standard law enforcement tools, proving the act was unnecessary. The most blatant abuse was freezing bank accounts without charges or judicial oversight, punishing peaceful demonstrators and supporters alike. The act was used not for security, but to silence dissent. If left unchecked, this sets a dangerous precedent for government overreach. So, on a scale of 1 to 10, where does Canada currently fall in terms of authoritarianism if 1 would be complete anarchy and 10 would be complete totalitarianism?
Given Trudeau's illegal use of the Emergencies Act, freezing bank accounts without judicial oversight, and just how this whole thing is sort of unfolded. You know, it's everybody's just kind of pointing at the other guy. Hey, this isn't my fault, it's his fault. And then they finally get to the government, where the government can just basically claim that, well, for national security reasons, we can't really discuss this, which is such bullshit. All that being said, I would suggest we have a score close to 6 or 7 on the authoritarian scale, which is pretty wild. We're not full totalitarian, full authoritarian. I get that. But if I can say Canada's a 6 or a 7 right now, that's not a good situation.
Yeah, pretty wild. And so this was all from a hearing where they had a bunch of different people questioning Brenda Lucki, who was the commissioner of the RCMP, and then CSIS director David Vigneault. And to their credit, most of them actually did a good job. Matthew Green from the NDP was grilling them pretty hard. Also, there was a guy from the Bloc Québécois who was grilling them hard. Larry Brock from the Conservatives went off on Brenda Lucki a couple times. But one thing that became clear to me with watching that, and again, they didn't directly say this, but it's clear with the way that they were trying to evade answers that even the RCMP commissioner and the CSIS director both know that there was no real use or no real justification for the Emergencies Act. And you could see it on their face while they're talking about it. So at one point, they asked the RCMP commissioner, what was the justification for doing so? And she tried hiding behind cabinet confidence. Well, she did effectively. And what was interesting there is the cabinet is supposed to have complete support for whatever decision they go with, because the whole way our parliamentary system works is the leader is accountable to their cabinet and the MPs at large, right? And so if they're not on the same page, then that's not having confidence in the leader. So it's actually part of our parliamentary system where they all have to be on the same page, and this is why you don't see many people in the Canadian government system go vote across party lines. Not that it happens a lot down in the States, for instance, but you do see more Congress members like a Tulsi Gabbard or whatever.
Yeah. That seems like a pretty flawed system.
For sure. But the reason for the cabinet confidentiality is so that those ministers and MPs and such can actually raise their concerns with certain policies or something behind closed doors, knowing that, okay, if we as a group agree on this, then I have to be public facing. I have to be in agreement with it.
Sort of like a jury decision.
Yeah. And so that's where that comes from. But I looked into it, and the RCMP commissioner is not bound by cabinet confidentiality. That actually, it only applies to the cabinet. However, when she is in discussions with the cabinet in a confidential meeting, sure, those things apply to new things that might come up. She's not able to then take that outside of that discussion and expose them. However, if the RCMP or CSIS for that matter had information outside of that cabinet committee and then brought it into them and said, like, that information isn't only within that committee. So they could have still, if they had any justification, she easily could have said, you know what? Yeah, so I briefed them on some of my concerns. I can't talk about what we discussed in here, but here's what we as the RCMP found before we went into that meeting.
Right.
And so it was just obviously such a backdoor escape kind of thing for her jumping on that.
I mean, if you look at the fact that the courts said that it was illegal, I think you're in a tough spot there, no matter how you sort of look at this. I mean, from the government's perspective, the RCMP, anybody involved, the argument's already on shaky ground, right? So I think we all know that this was a lot of bullshit, and now the justice system said it was bullshit. And then you sort of look at this. To be honest with you, like when I'm saying this out loud, I'm kind of like, why even have this hearing? Mm-hmm. In a sense, like we already know that it's nonsense. We know that they've got access to an out by saying a few things, which they're going to likely do. So it kind of almost feels performative. You know, the Liberal government's already been slapped on the hand for the decision. It was ultimately their decision to make, and they did it. So it's like, why aren't we just focusing solely on repercussions and accountability for the sitting Liberal government? Why isn't that the path that we're on?
Like there has to be repercussions for these kind of things, because now it's not a direct analogy because, you know, the private versus public property thing comes into play here when they're cracking down on them in a public space. But I wrote that, you know, this is the equivalent of law enforcement raiding someone's home without a warrant, pepper spraying them, beating them with a baton, zip tying them face down on the floor, freezing their assets, and then being unable to explain what justifications they had for doing so even afterwards.
Right.
That's wild. That's a wild precedent to set. And so to me, like, if there isn't major accountability for this, being like, oh, we actually just went into a state where we completely overrode everybody's rights and gave ourselves ultimate power to do whatever we wanted without judicial oversight. Like, you don't have a functioning democracy if a regime does that and they don't face consequences and they had no reason to do it in the first place.
I totally agree with you. But here's my problem is that I think a lot of us are on that page right now. Your analogy certainly highlights it a little more, maybe sensationalizes it in a way that makes it a little more impactful, which I can certainly appreciate. So I kind of go back to that previous point. Yes, you're right. But the only people right now that we can really go at, or in my opinion, the only people we should really be going at is the government. Sure. Like the RCMP, they basically followed their orders in a sense, right? So it's like, yeah, you can give them trouble. You can make the connection between, you know, a Nazi soldier doing what he's told. You can totally do that. No problem. But again, we look at Hitler and go, he's the bad guy. Yes, I understand the other people are caught in the fray, and yes, they did bad things. But you need to focus. If you're going to fix the problem, you need to focus at the head of the snake. So all of our efforts, in my opinion, should be framed exactly the way you just put it in your analogy. And we should be focusing on how can we fix this from the top down, because otherwise it's just going to continue to happen. And if some of these people on this lower level end up being the fall guy, like if a few soldiers end up getting blamed for what Hitler did and that's it, well, now this guy can basically build another army and go at it again.
Right. Completely agree. And actually, I think the most telling part of that whole commission, because again, most of it was just evasion, but Senator Claude Kerrigan at one point pointed out a contradiction when he was asking the RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lucki on why Ottawa required emergency powers while other blockades were resolved without them. So for instance, like at the Coutts border, right? You know, we had Gordon McGill come on in the past and break down the whole Coutts border thing with the firearms situation, etc. However, even if you want to take the complete establishment narrative on the Coutts border and go, okay, they had a weapons cache there and they were planning on using it against law enforcement. Okay, so that's clearly a more dangerous situation than what they faced in Ottawa.
Yes.
Yet they were able to dismantle Coutts border without the Emergencies Act, right? So if that was a more threatening protest and potentially more violent, a bigger quote unquote national security threat, and you didn't need it there, why did you need it in Ottawa? And so he was this Senator Claude Kerrigan was pushing her on this and said, "Are you saying Ottawa police were incapable of enforcing the law?" And Lucky admitted, she said, quote, "No, I'm saying the Emergencies Act made it easier to clear the protest." And so to me, I go, wow, that's an admission in a sense, is going, oh, it wasn't that this was necessary, it's that it was convenient for us.
For sure. I think that's something that you're able to catch the RCMP on, because they're the ones that were actually boots on the ground, so to speak. So I feel like that's what you can convince these people, and that they were doing the right thing by saying, oh, well, it was more convenient. We needed to do it because of X. It seems like that's the narrative they've convinced themselves of, if they still believe it in any sense. But I imagine from a government perspective, there were other probably no more nefarious reasons for launching it. I don't know all of them, but you could see it from their action with freezing bank accounts. This obviously had more to do with just breaking apart the protests. But I mean, it's interesting that she didn't say, well, in Coots versus in Ottawa, we were outnumbered significantly. There was a real problem. This was, we were at a point where we just couldn't possibly meet the threshold of military and police personnel to the size of the crowd that was getting out of hand. Like, that would have been at least my response. You know what I mean? I would have said something to that effect versus like, oh, it was just easier.
Well, another telling aspect was that in that whole commission, it came up that they never actually even applied for, say, military help. Within our legal system, there's something called aid to the civil power. And this is when you request, say, military help for local law enforcement or something like that. They never even applied for that or even looked into it or tried to make that happen before going into the Emergencies Act. So they had all of these other tools they could have potentially used. And actually, one thing that I thought was interesting in there as well that came up in that commission was, so, okay, they used the tow truck excuse and how they weren't able to get the tow truck companies to come in and take out the trucks. It's speculation. I'm sure different people did it for different reasons. Some companies I know probably just wanted to avoid the bad press of being like, oh, I don't want to be the company that took down this grassroots protest. Or also, too, it's very possible, this is the very same type of people as, say, the truckers. So it's a very similar class of people. And so they were probably sympathetic towards it.
Yes.
And so they just were like, no, I don't want to tear down a protest I support. But, however, under the criminal code, section 129B, it allows police to order private citizens to assist in law enforcement if all other options have been exhausted. And if those citizens refuse, they can criminally charge them for obstruction, essentially.
That's wild.
That's not something I necessarily
agree
reservists.
with. Yeah, that's kind of crazy.
Yeah.
You got to pick and choose the right people. A lot of people would freeze during the headlights.
Right.
8 out of 10 people, you're like, give me a hand. They'd be like, they would be more of a liability.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so,
that's wild.
So that is nuts. But even just under the current, criminal code, they could have compelled tow trucks. They didn't need the Emergencies Act in order to compel those companies.
I think it's pretty clear. If you look at this situation, I think it's pretty clear to say this was drawn out long before it happened. This was the plan. The old man pulled it and Justin Trudeau pulled it. And people are like, oh, well, that's not really core. I'm like, no, the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree. Bear with me for a second. There are no less than half a dozen, maybe more opportunities that they had to do something else other than use the Emergencies Act. But what did they did immediately before this thing even kicked off? They smeared them in the media. So already they were calling them extremists and dangerous and smeared them in the media. So they used their propaganda tools a week before the protest even started. This whole thing was organized. Immediately after that, Chrystia Freeland got on the microphone and laughed in everybody's face while they froze our bank accounts. So it didn't matter what options they had. Those were just inconveniences that were in the way. This was planned. And so back to the main point, anarchy or totalitarianism, we're at least at a 6 or a 7 if your government's sitting there planning to basically bend all of the rules of democracy to put you under their thumb.
Right. I don't even think it's a bending the rule. I think it was a straight up just ignoring them. There was no democratic element to any of this. And, this is kind of a precursor to our last topic. And so we'll circle back around to this probably. But, the concept of ruling through fear or love, this was something that Machiavelli talked about a lot, like admiration or should your subjects fear you. I think, to be honest, my personal opinion, I don't have any government documents or anything to support this. I think the whole purpose of invoking the Emergencies Act was very similar to the Tiananmen Square incident in China, where, obviously that was much more brutal of a crackdown. However, the message that gets sent there is you have zero power.
It's
Don't
fear,
fuck with us.
it's self-censorship, and it's do what you're told.
Right.
Absolutely.
And actually, just to reaffirm that point, this is actually something that got brought up in that commission. She said that as soon as we invoked the Emergencies Act and started threatening what was coming,
yes,
in that commission, the RCMP commissioner admitted that in and of itself was enough to start making the crowd disperse. So again, right then and there, actually, she is admitting it. Like, this was a fear tool. Us invoking this was beneficial because it struck fear into the public.
Which is interesting, right? Because when this stuff happens, you look at the leader, right? Like, Justin Trudeau is a meek, wet noodle of a leader, right? He's very effeminate. He invokes, as an individual, a 0% amount of fear in anybody. Yeah. No, he really does. And I mean, I imagine that those are the kinds of people. It's like, short man syndrome, the Napoleon syndrome. Like, oh, I'm going to get you. I'm going to prove to it. I'm going to be angry and mean. I think it's something similar. I think if he were a strong, powerful leader, because he's not ruling in Russia, he's ruling in Canada. So there's obviously authoritarian tactics there anyway. But if he were a strong, competent leader, I don't think he would have chosen this path.
Right. All right, next story for the day. We've got on again, off again. Trump reverses course again, says Canada tariffs back on for March 4th. Donald Trump has once again reversed course on his tariff plans, now insisting that the previously delayed March 4th tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China will proceed. This follows a series of shifting deadlines, originally set for January 1st, then moved to February, and later given a last-minute 30-day extension. Trump cites fentanyl concerns and claims Canada has failed to act. Even Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick was caught off guard, suggesting Canada had until April 2nd to comply, only for Trump to dismiss the idea. With two looming tariff deadlines and mixed signals from the administration, uncertainty dominates trade relations. So, is Trump's unpredictability a strategic advantage, or is it causing more harm than good?
It's interesting. I mean, it obviously indicates a bit of instability and a lack of effective planning. But I do actually believe Trump can still use this to his advantage on the global stage, because it keeps all foreign nations on their toes, being like, what the fuck is this guy going to do next? Because he's wielding a lot of power, and he's just spinning in a circle. It's like he's got an Uzi spinning in a circle with the safety off, and he's had a few drinks. And we're all standing around this guy like, what the fuck's going to happen? So it's a little, it can be to his advantage. It does show instability, but it may actually begin to cause some distrust from Americans.
Yeah.
See how that goes, right? I mean, you do look for stability from your leadership, even if they're doing the right things for your country. If that's the perspective you have, that they're doing the right things for your country, when they behave in the way that I kind of described, you start to get a little uneasy for yourself, right? You feel like you're not sure you can depend on the foundation you're standing on. And I think when you consider business or entrepreneurship or sort of an up and down shaky economy, I can say it as an entrepreneur. What you do is you depend on a firm foundation, because you make decisions that are risky. So to mitigate that, you need a firm foundation to stand on. And that's kind of like being able to depend on your economy, employment, all those other things. But if that's shaky, then you can't actually take the risks or try to advance your career, because you got to worry about sort of like the Maslow hierarchy of needs. So I know that was a little disjointed, but you understand what I'm saying is his instability may cause a lack of trust from Americans.
It's kind of like the friend that, I mean, he's getting to the point. It's wild watching the trolling at this level, because that's what it is.
It's wild.
It is like 13-year-old bully style trolling.
Yes.
Trolling. It's wild. But it's kind of like the friend that, is on a road trip, and once everyone gets complacent and silent, starts jerking the wheel just to be like, just wanted to make sure you guys are awake. And you're like, this is I don't know if this is the best the best strategy here. But at some point with this, not that I want them to come, but I do think Trump is starting to find himself in a position where, his threats are going to start wearing off if he doesn't follow through with them. But then also, I think it also says something about Canada that is kind of very embarrassing and disheartening, in a sense where how are we in this scenario where somebody on the world stage can make a tweet and it sends the whole country into a frenzy, worrying about our future, whether we'll even be a nation? Like, we should be in a position, or we should have been at least building ourselves for the last couple decades, or the goal should always be to be building yourself up economically and militarily, because those are the two big levers you have as a nation to make sure that you have influence. But the fact that we have no ground to stand on in either of those domains, to just be like, hey, fuck your tweets. Because if we were a strong country, that'd be able to be what you'd say. But we have to react to it. Even just the fact that it's just a tweet.
Well, I think there's a couple things to consider there, right? First is poor leadership driven primarily by a climate change and green agenda. Those are the facts. People can argue it, back into it. It's the truth. The next thing is this country is going to take a hit from these things. So I understand that there is a bit of an uproar or concern or a bit of frenzy, if you will. We're looking at losing at least 100,000 jobs. Our GDP, according to analysts now, look like it could drop by as much as 4%, which is well over $100 billion annually. Obviously, inflation is going to rise. They're assuming it's going to hit about 3%. And this is going to be on big things like food, gas, and housing, because energy is going to be hit, right? It looks like an $11 billion swing coming from Alberta. $11 billion. They were looking at a surplus of 5.8. Now they're looking at a deficit of 5.2.
Wow.
So it's pretty significant. Our dollar is also trading at a 3-week low at $1.44.25 per American right now. So what that also means is that no one will invest in this country, right? So the reason that's significant is if you don't have investment, then you don't have recovery, right? So there are some like legitimate short-term concerns to have. But again, to your point, this is all because of bad governance. We should not be in this position. We should be leveraging our natural resources. We should have far more diverse trading partners. Like, we put ourselves in such a bad spot here. But here's the other reason why this is happening. The liberals are using this to catapult themselves back into power. They are using this as leverage. Everybody should be afraid because of what Trump is doing to us. Everybody kick and scream right now. We've got a huge problem. And that's Pierre Poilievre. He's the exact same guy. Vote us into power. Everything will be fine.
Right.
So it's a power grab as well.
It was very telling that the entire leadership debate the other night with Carney,
ridiculous.
Gould, and Freeland was
Freeland's only platform was Trump.
Right. And the insanity of even what they were talking about in regards to Trump. At one point, Freeland talked about how we need to create alliances with other countries in the world. And she specifically said the UK and France because they have nuclear weapons.
You want to have a nuclear military alliance against America on your southern border
over tariffs.
You're an idiot.
You're saying we need to, again, just like they go to the
whatever drugs she's on, I want them. That's it. That's like I keep not saying on camera that she's high on Vyvanse and cocaine or whatever else it may be. Whatever it is, just share some with the group.
Well, you think about it again. Okay, I am just going to take everything to every extreme when a scenario isn't going the way that I want it to. We just covered the Freedom Convoy, right? Okay, if I have any pushback, or if I'm in a scenario at all where I feel like my back is against the wall, my initial reaction is either to suspend everybody's rights, or in this case, I need to have a nuclear alliance.
Oh my God. With our neighbor.
Yeah. Oh man. It's actually legitimate insanity.
Yeah, what the wind is gonna blow from dude, what are you doing? It's just insane.
But if you think about it from, say, Canada, if you think about nations as just businesses.
Sure.
I guess where I was trying to go with the prior analogy was just kind of talking about, like, okay, if you are a company, sure, you can have a big customer that is very important to you as a company. But if one customer can leave you and sink your entire company, you're not a good business.
So a good example of this in the real world is our automotive sector is about to get pummeled. Mm-hmm. Now there are cities and towns where all they have is auto manufacturing, like Detroit used to in the States. So you look at like Alliston with the Honda plant. Honda's already saying this is going to cost them $20 billion. Now they're looking at moving plants here and there, talking about Mexico, Canada. Every major auto manufacturer is discussing this. If you have a town that depends solely on an auto manufacturing plant that's providing, say, 50 to 60% of the jobs because it's a small rural area, land is cheap, and you've got a big facility, this makes sense. When that shuts down, what happens? Every business in that community dies, and the real estate value in that community falls through the fucking floor.
Right.
So you don't just hurt the auto manufacturing, you hurt the entire town. This is very real and going to happen in Canada, in Ontario, in the coming months.
Well, I think that's why you see guys like Carney moving his, Brookfield and being part of the decision to move Brookfield to the States. They realize these sorts of things that they
100%.
go, oh, I need to hedge my bets. And so it's absolutely crazy right now that you go, oh, okay, so Carney is saying that he's, the best in the business in order to be able to take on somebody like Trump in this scenario, but he's already hedging his bets as if he's going to lose.
Yes, 100%, or at least that Canada's going to lose,
right.
Whatever that looks like.
And actually, the Liberal Nature Resources Minister said the quiet part out loud in regards to this.
We have all these ministers.
Just to come clean on the Brookfield move, though?
What I would say is, irrespective of this particular instance, anyone who knows anything about business knows that boards actually have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders. I wasn't in the room. I don't know what the conversations were, but I know Mr. Carney is a man of very high ethics. At the end of the day, his job as a chairman of a board is to act in the best interests of shareholders. I'm sure he did that, but in terms of the specifics, you've got to ask Mr. Carney.
Yeah, he's not wrong. I mean, I had this conversation the other day. Like, you do have a fiduciary duty to your company. It makes perfect sense. It's just you shouldn't be able to do both. This is your conflict of interest.
100%. I actually agree that if you're sitting on $1 trillion in Canada right now, I was talking to somebody close to me that has a decent amount of cash, and I was telling them, like, hey, you should think about whether moving that out of it or making sure it's in assets that appreciate,
not liquid cash,
or whatever.
Yeah.
Like, do something with your cash to hedge your bets against what's coming. And so I don't disagree with the fact that that's the best business move for Brookfield. But then for him to be able to, for a guy like Carney, who's been advising on Canada's economy for the last 5 years, and also saying that he's the one to deal with this, and that, or, this has been a common liberal attack against, say, people like Pierre Poilievre, who claims that Canada is broken, which I think he's entirely correct about.
100% correct.
But it's like, you can't then say that Canada isn't broken, but then simultaneously being like, I need to...
But I have a fiduciary duty to get all my assets out of here because it's broken. I mean...
So I think his business decision was right, but all of his political rhetoric doesn't follow in line with how he's actually acting.
To me, this is the thing. Both... You can do either one, but you can't do both at the same time. That's my problem. That's my big problem with this guy, is there's a major conflict of interest, but, he's going to hide it, which is interesting. Here's why I think this is interesting. He's going to hide. He's not going to disclose his conflicts of interest prior to the Liberal leadership race, even though he is probably a 10-1 favorite right now to win. I don't even think it's close. So if I were him, I would disclose it now, and I would manage this shitstorm, and then win 4-1, 5-1. You still win, because if you wait, once you're going head to head with the Conservatives, and then it comes out, now you're fucked. Because it is, the Conservatives already have all the information. They've got the TikTok video ready to go. So it's just like, to me, this is actually a bad strategic move on his part, because if you did it now, in a few weeks from now, he'd be like, yeah, so what? That's old news. I already disclosed it. Now where's your ammo, Conservatives?
Right.
But he's doing what he's doing.
Hey everyone, we hope you're enjoying this episode. If so, please consider leaving us a kind review wherever you're listening. If even just a quarter of our weekly audience did so, we'd instantly become one of the top-rated Canadian podcasts. We appreciate you helping us out, and now back to the show. All right, moving on to our next story, we've got the Epstein files. More redactions, more distractions, no justice. The Justice Department's long-anticipated Epstein document release was a letdown, revealing little beyond already public flight logs, redacted masseuse lists, and his known contact book. Missing were new names or real evidence of Epstein's powerful network. Despite claims that this was just phase one, Attorney General Pam Bondi demanded full disclosure by Friday, though skepticism remains high. Epstein's deep ties to world elites and the suspicious circumstances of his death continue to fuel distrust. This release appears to be a carefully controlled narrative exercise rather than a step towards real transparency, leaving the public with more frustration than answers. So, what are the odds that we'll ever see a full unredacted Epstein client list?
This is such a fucking piss off. But exactly what I expected, right? I have a liberal buddy actually that I was talking to. One of my very best friends. He's a staunch liberal. It's not that bright, but but I love him. We were talking about this, and he was like, "Oh well, yeah. I think what's going to happen is like, they're not going to release the list because there's Republicans on it. Blah blah blah." Like thinking I'd push back. I'm like, "Yeah, no, I think the same thing. It's going to be terrible. I'm very upset about it." He's like, "Oh, yeah, no, we're aligned. This sucks." I heard a couple other things too that I have nothing to back this up. Just people that I listen to, like Ian Carroll. I really like him. I think he's very well researched. He was talking about the Mossad being involved, and he's like, too many of these guys. If this is a list controlled by the Mossad, how much control do they have over other facets of other things? And what people should consider. So there's two ways that I see this. I see this as there are Republicans on that list. They don't want to sully the party right now, or people that are instrumental in maybe where things are going for America. So that is one side of it. The other side of it is that it's controlled by a group like the Mossad that's got everybody by the balls.
Well, just for context, Mossad is Israeli intelligence.
Yes. Thanks. Sorry, I just figure I don't know. Sometimes you just feel like everybody knows what you're talking about. So if that's the case, think about it like this. Even if there were no relevant or important Republicans on that list, but it was controlled, whatever the strategy is behind the Epstein list and the Epstein leverage, if it's controlled by the Mossad and the Mossad go, look, yes, you could release this list, but here's 10 other things we're going to do to you if you do that. Mm-hmm. Here's where we've got leverage over you in all of these other different areas where if you do this, I'm going to cause you a lot of grief. And this is a huge stretch. This is a huge stretch when I say this. But Mossad intelligence is pretty well known around the world to be top-notch, top of the food chain. So what's to say that they wouldn't allow things to happen in America that they've currently got under control? So they've obviously got a hand in the Middle East. And now I want to be very clear. This is all subjective. I have no idea if this is true at all. Nothing to back it up. But they've got their finger on the pulse in the Middle East. And what do we see coming from the Middle East? You see a lot of sort of terrorist groups in the Middle East and a lot of people that are very upset with America. Now, if the Mossad is sort of controlling traffic down there, and they do know what's going on in all these different cells in America and Canada and all these other places, if they want that list and that's important enough to them, they could simply go, again, this is just a guess, they could simply go, well, we're going to take our foot off the gas on this, and you guys can deal with them. You can deal with, the multitude of terrorists that could be in your country or could be on their way to your country from Iraq, Iran, from Syria, from anywhere else. Good luck with that. Again, I have no idea if this is true. I'm just building a scenario so people understand that this might actually be a lot bigger than what's on the list, and who's on the list might not be what's stopping them from releasing it. No idea, but just a thought.
Well, if you think about it from a Mossad operation, if the most plausible narrative around the whole Epstein thing is that, yes, he was a Mossad agent, that his whole operation was aimed at getting blackmail on influential people around the world in order to, say, get them to do bidding or have leverage on them, right?
Influence.
And so you look at that and you just go okay, how many people, to your point about whether it's Republicans or this to me would definitely hop across party lines.
For sure.
And so you go, okay, you're asking the people that are compromised on those lists to release the lists.
Potentially, yes.
Most likely.
Potentially, yes. But that's what I'm saying is that may be the case and it may be the other case. It's one of the two things. It's either the point of leverage, whoever controls it in this scenario, if it is the Mossad, don't know if it is, but let's say that it is. If it is that group, right? And the leverage that they're gaining, that they have over people, is worth a very significant amount to their organization, then they will do a lot to make sure they can maintain it. So it's that, or there are names on the list that are key Republicans right now, and that getting out would be very disruptive to the American community, economy, society, etc. It's one of the two.
You can kind of look at it as a very similar concept to, say, a dead man's switch, which is, if you're going to take somebody out, you go, all right, I've got a bomb. You can shoot me and take me out as a threat, but that makes me release this trigger.
Yes.
And we all go.
Yes.
And so it's very similar, I think, to that, where in, say, Israel or Mossad's hands, it's go ahead, release it. You guys go down with us.
Yes.
And so I think that's probably the most likely scenario here.
It's kind of what I'm saying, basically, in a different way.
But And two, also with this, just understanding the history of, say, the CIA and all of those kind of things, and intelligence agencies in general, I am of the mind that any extremely disruptive evidence was destroyed long before Trump got into office.
Yeah.
Even actually, who's that CIA operative that's now become a podcaster? He's got the long curly hair. I can't remember his name, but he makes the rounds and whatever. There was a good discussion. It was in regards to the JFK assassination and releasing those papers.
Okay.
But even he admitted on Piers Morgan, he was like, "Oh yeah, like just a heads up, like CIA has no problem destroying documents."
Yeah.
Like, so I think what's most likely to happen here is that we're going to see 20% of the picture, 80-20 rule. We're going to see 20% of the picture of Epstein.
Yeah.
That makes the general population think they're seeing 80%.
Yeah. See, the only thing I would push back on is the evidence. And I'll tell you why. Because the evidence is key for whoever controls the list.
Mm-hmm.
They need the leverage over the people, or else the entire thing is useless. So the evidence is actually crucial. It's just a matter of who has the evidence.
Right, but if that's in Israel, then there's nothing that, say, Trump or whatever.
But
can
I
do
still
about
think it would exist. Whereas, if it were the JFK assassination, gone. Like people can tell their stories, otherwise it doesn't exist.
I agree with you in the sense where if that evidence doesn't exist, they don't have the leverage anymore. However, if that evidence that you're holding on to starts to become more of a liability than it does a asset, I could see them cutting ties with going like, yeah, this has been helpful to us for the last 2 decades, 3 decades, but at this point it's a bomb that's about to go off in our hand, and so it's best to throw that into the ocean.
I think it really depends on how much leverage they still have over the individuals that are implicated.
Yeah.
Right? So it's like, Bill Clinton's still around. Bill Gates is still around. I'm obviously throwing out names. I don't know how involved they were. I do know Gates visited frequently. That's a fact.
Clinton flew on the plane 26 times. Definitely 20 times. Definitely over 20 times within the span of 2 years, from 2001 to 2003.
He's a busy guy.
Yes.
And we also know that there was a painting of Bill Clinton in the front hallway of Jeffrey Epstein's, I believe, New York condo, of him dressed like a woman. And here, like, it's the kind of leverage you would have to have over someone, a president, to be able to walk in your house and you have a painting of him up on your front hallway wall dressed like a woman. Must be something I've never seen.
I think the craziest painting that Epstein had was of Bush playing with the 2 fallen Jenga towers holding a paper plane.
Wow.
That's a wild one.
Right. So again, like you said, with crossing party lines. So again, it really comes down to how much leverage does the evidence still provide,
right?
Whoever controls it. So like you said, the reality is this is just like everything else. We're not going to get the full picture. Like your question originally is, what are the odds? 1 in 10. I think it's literally 10%. And I think I'm being charitable.
Yeah, I think it's a win as long as the general public doesn't, like, even if, let's say, we don't get the full story, even if that makes the general public go, okay, wait, how did we not get the full story?
Yeah.
As long as there's questions about it, that I would see as a win in the grand scheme of things. I think the worst case scenario is getting a sliver of the evidence that doesn't paint any actual real picture.
Yes.
And then people going, justice was served. That would be the worst case scenario.
I don't think they will. I think the nice thing is, even the Republican, this was kind of a weird how they released the list to like Republican, I don't know, influencers or what the fuck it was.
Right,
anyway,
that was weird.
That was kind of whatever. So they had a strategy. I didn't really appreciate it or agree with it. But either way, some of those Republican influencers even said they were underwhelmed and upset.
Yeah.
So it's like, that's not even working. You can't move the needle that way with everybody. You can do it with a small cohort of people that'll just suck the party's dick no matter what, because that's who they are. They just love it. They don't care. They are blue no matter who, or they're red until the day they die. That's just cool. That doesn't work though at scale because of social media, because you've got, the entire Democratic population now, which is interesting because they were hiding the list before, but I guarantee you now they'll be complaining that they're not getting the true story. So that's not going to stop. But then there were a lot of people that are very neutral. And what's interesting, the Epstein list transcends American politics too. You and I are Canadian going, I want the answers here. So you can't really get away with that, I don't think, in this case. So I think you're either going to have to release enough so we do get some of the picture, or you're going to get a lot of pushback because they're hiding a lot of it.
Well, last thing to point out from there before moving on is Mark Carney's sister-in-law was on that list. All right, next story. Next story for the day, we've got mass Liberal exodus. Over 30 MPs jump ship while pollsters still pretend they stand a chance. The mass exodus of Liberal MPs has reached over 30, nearly a quarter of the party, signaling a deep crisis within the Trudeau government. High-profile figures, including Justice Minister Arif Virani and Housing Minister Sean Fraser, are abandoning ship alongside long-time MPs with decades in Parliament. This is more than routine turnover, it's a stampede for the exits. While polls suggest a tight race, the reality is clear. These MPs don't believe they can win. After years of economic mismanagement, scandals, and broken promises, they are walking away from the wreckage. This isn't just political transition, it's the beginning of the collapse. Are these MPs leaving because they sense electoral defeat? Are there deeper internal fractures within the Liberal Party? Or are they trying to flee the crime scene before they can be held accountable for their policies and scandals?
All of the above. Like you knew that was coming. But it really is all of the above, right? Like I think there's an impending electoral defeat if they call an election anytime soon. Obviously, these are not backbenchers. These are very significant characters within the Liberal Party. So I think it really does highlight an internal fracture. And you look at what the last 10 years looked like. I don't know one Liberal that's trying to stand behind those policies. So I think it is all three, but I would also like to take the opportunity to sort of explain why I think the recent polls calling the Liberals and Conservatives neck and neck is absolute nonsense. Because you see that in the polls. Now, first of all, you get the guy from Ecos Research, Frank Graves. Frank Graves is the founder and president of Ecos Research. He's leading the charge in reporting that the Liberals are neck and neck. He also said, I'm not going to exactly quote it, but he basically called Poilievre a populist and said that he would never run his country and said he'll do everything he can to stop him. And then he said, I don't make idle threats. Now, he has since deleted that tweet. However, as we know, the internet never forgets. So that's what you're getting from the pollsters. The other thing, and that's just one, but anyway, it's a significant one. The other thing that is important to understand is how our government works. So in our parliamentary system, we obviously elect our MPs. I know people know that. We don't just elect the president or the prime minister. So for there to be a significant rise in the polls, there would have to be a lot of communal support for Liberals. However, at the community level, everyone's feeling the carnage over the last 10 years, whether it's economics, job losses, the drop in GDP, the rise in immigration, all the nonsense. Take your pick. It doesn't really matter. There's a lot to choose from. What kids are being taught in school. It almost doesn't matter. Everywhere you look, there's a problem. So that is actually, that is the objective path that Canada's been on for 10 years. So the polls, I think, are more of an indication that Carney is gaining some momentum against Poilievre, maybe in the fight against Trump. But the reality is this election is won from the MPs at more of the local level. And there is no way, with 25%, nearly 25% of their party leaving, and they were all, like I said, significant leaders, not backbenchers, and the rest have to stick around to sort of wear the mess that's happened. There's no way that group of people have built support over the last four to 6 weeks while they haven't even had a real leader. The chair is basically empty right now. So there's just no way. Like, if they call an election, this will be a landslide conservative win, and I welcome it. It'll be very much a Trump-Kamala Harris situation where they're like, oh yeah, she's neck and neck, and then you get blown out of the water.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think we're being Kamala Harris right now when it comes to this whole... Because you see, too, even people, especially on the, say, conservative front, being concerned about a lot of the polls that are coming out showing that the Liberals and Conservatives are neck and neck or whatever. But I don't know. It just, to me, I don't see that. I don't see Carney being able to all of a sudden make people, their memories of the last 10 years just vanish. And also, too, it's very important to note that every public interaction that Carney has had so far since announcing that he's leader has been carefully constructed.
Yes.
So, for instance, you see at his rallies, okay, they bar journalists like, say, Cian Bexty or the guy from Western Standard.
Independent journalism.
Right.
Yeah, anybody that's got anything bad to say.
Right. And so didn't let them in. You also see in the, like, without a doubt, Carney and stuff is getting, I don't have evidence for this, but I would be willing to bet a substantial amount of money that he's getting questions before these leadership debates and stuff.
Definitely.
Like, he's getting prep time, all of that kind of thing. Very similar to Kamala Harris in that sense.
Well, he's the chosen one, right? So they're going to give all the resources to him.
And then too, you even see as well say for instance, CBC backing him as well in the sense where, he made that slip up in the French debate where in French he said we side with Hamas
Yeah.
or something along those lines. He said with Hamas, which again, I do think it was just a genuine language switch up.
Oh,
of him
it totally
talking
was.
the
I
same
can't speak
language.
French. I'm an idiot. I'd get
For sure.
ripped if I had to do a French debate right now.
But it was very telling that when you watched the media reaction to that, they all started covering for him. Whereas if Pierre Poilievre had said that, they would have been on him. They wouldn't have given him any,
I agree with that.
any doubt. Or at the very least, even if they did give him the, oh yeah, it was a correction, he didn't say that, they would have doubled down on being like, but his French isn't good enough to be a leader or whatever.
Yeah, which is kind of, really pisses me off because like a decent human being would just go, trying to speak two languages, no problem.
Right.
You made a mistake. I'm not a fan of Mark Carney or the Liberals right now. And that's still my response and still the appropriate response.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway.
For sure. But the larger point there is that I think all of this support and buzz and the picture that is being portrayed of Carney is completely fabricated. It's a bubble, just like the Kamala bubble.
Yes.
And all it's going to take is somebody, and I do think Poilievre, whether you agree with him or like him or not, I do think that he is quick enough on his feet.
Yes, he's
and
sharp.
He's witty enough.
Yeah.
And he's sharp that he can, again, if you're sharp and you come across a bubble, it's pretty easy to burst it.
Yep.
And I think that's what I've said because I had a buddy, say that he was deeply concerned about, say, the way that it's looking for Carney and that there's a liberal resurgence. And I was like, man, I agree that this is what we're seeing, but you put him on a debate stage with somebody that can actually grill him.
Yeah.
It's gone.
He's basically gonna have to not answer.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I agree. And you know what's interesting though? That we just saw, you and I were talking about this earlier today. The polls, what they were predicting in just Ontario. So they were predicting, a 22-point lead, then a 20-point lead, then a 15-point lead. Oh, the Liberals are closing in on them. It's getting close. And then the Conservatives absolutely crushed the NDP. The Liberals were in third.
Yeah.
But
Crombie didn't even win her own riding.
And Crombie didn't exactly. So you look at the polls, you go, those weren't worth shit. The liberal media controls them, and look what they tried to say. That's not at all what happened. So you look at that, and if I'm Mark Carney, I'm the Liberals, I would look at that and go, ooh,
yeah,
we need to reconsider because these polls may be saying one thing, but that reality looks very, very different. So I don't know. We'll see if they take that as a warning sign. I would, but then again, they're also living in this world of sort of narcissism and these weird silos anyway, so maybe it means nothing. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I think one telling aspect as well is Ecos, Frank Graves, who said that, he'll do everything in his power to make sure Pierre Poilievre doesn't lead Canada. He recently, in his polling, shows the highest support for Liberals. But you go look at, he recently released the demographics of those polls. Very telling. So when you look at social class, poor people are voting in favor of Conservatives over Liberals by 32 to 27. Working class, 39% for Conservatives over 30% Liberals. Middle class, 41% Conservatives over 35% Liberals. However, upper class, 50% Liberals to 31% Conservatives.
That is a very, very important thing for people to understand what the Liberal Party has become.
Exactly. It's the party of rich people, upper class. And then you do age as well, and it's the same thing. So for age, for under 35, it's 37 for Conservatives, 26 Liberals. 35 to 49 is 40% Conservatives, 28% Liberals. 49 to 64 is 44% Conservatives, 35% Liberals. But then 65 plus is 48% Liberals, 33% Conservatives. So what that tells you is it's not only rich people, it's rich people over 65. And those are the people that have gotten rich as a and they've only gotten wealthier as a result of this societal collapse.
Yeah, yes.
Because they probably had their mortgages paid off before all of this housing shit went through the roof.
Yes.
And so they weren't subjected to a lot of, say, variable rate changes.
Well, a lot of them just doubled their net worth.
Exactly.
A lot of people, yeah.
And so you look at it and you go, wow, that is actually really crazy to notice about this is you go, okay, any support for the Liberals that does exist on a mass scale is by people that have benefited off of the collapse of our country, and then also that won't be around long enough to really deal with the long-term consequences of, say, another 5 to 10 years of this
so
party.
basically they're voting the country into the ground if they vote Liberal.
Right.
Congrats.
And
Thanks.
they won't
Thanks.
and they're old enough that they won't even bear the consequences.
Not at
of
all.
it.
No. Well, they also just doubled their wealth, so they're okay.
Yeah. All right. Story number 5 for the day, we've got from Beijing to Davos, the globalist web behind Mark Carney's rise. As Justin Trudeau prepares to step aside, his globalist backers are pivoting to a new figurehead, Mark Carney. The same power brokers, Gerald Butts, Dominic Barton, and Mark Wiseman, are positioning Carney to maintain Canada's trajectory towards a technocratic future. Carney's record reveals deep ties to China's infrastructure bank. That's essentially the same thing as what we do for our foreign aid through like World Bank and stuff. So he's tied to China's international development. And his role in the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which pressures financial institutions to enforce climate policies by restricting consumer choice. His allies also push mass migration through the Century Initiative, which aims to have Canada's population to be 100 million by 2100. So that's 1 million people per year. And they have a complete disregard for economic and infrastructure concerns. Trudeau was just the warm-up, it seems. Carney represents the next phase of centralized control over Canada's economy, industry, and demographics. So, what does the overlap between Carney's backers with Butts, Barton, and Wiseman, all connected to China and also the World Economic Forum, reveal about Canada's political direction?
That we have a group of oligarchs promoting global governance over nationalism, who support active government intervention in the economy rather than free market approach, and will continue with their relentless push for climate policy and the green agenda as a point of leverage to continue maintaining control over Canadians and clearly to line their own pockets.
Yep, that's pretty solid. Let's go through each one of these people in Carney's inner circle a little bit more, because again, you're not just voting for a individual, you're voting for the people they surround themselves with as well. So Dominic Barton, one of the key people in this circle, is a McKinsey strategist and China liaison. He was the managing director of McKinsey and has deep business ties to China. He chaired Trudeau's advisory council on economic growth, which was the whole push for mass immigration. He was Canada's ambassador to China from 2019 to 2021, and he handled the Meng Wanzhou's extradition case. That was the whole Huawei scandal.
Yeah.
And then he's also a large standing ally of Carney, instrumental in shaping economic and trade policy. So that's concerning enough, especially when you consider, okay, how much money guys like Trudeau have been funneling into McKinsey and such since he took office.
For sure, but also how deeply entrenched we're already with China and how much more it will probably increase given, with or at least continue on the same path. And, we're also at this precipice of America-China.
Right.
You know what I mean? So the last thing we need is a group that's more favorable towards China.
You've got Trump right now trying to push back against the subversion of China on a global scale. He's very much trying to be like, I don't see him trying to go and take the position where he's like, we're going to go over there and put them in their place. But I think he is trying to say, nope, this is our sphere of influence and get the hell out of it.
Yep, I agree.
Like this is our circle. Don't cross this line. And so if you don't think that Trump and his administration is looking at people like Carney in these inner circles as a direct threat to his sphere of influence or America's sphere of influence, if America was ever to actually want to like full-blown annex Canada, if that's a real thing and not just trolling, this would only accelerate it.
Yes, even if the intention was military strategy, like having a strategic military alliance. I've been thinking about, after I listened to what Steve Bannon was saying about Trump looking to sort of create a military line essentially from Greenland down to Panama that's all controlled by the United States, potentially including an Iron Dome type infrastructure for safety and for just, military strategy. I started thinking about this 51st state thing, and I thought about something you said. When Trump wants to negotiate with people, a bit of a tangent, but I find it interesting. When Trump wants to negotiate with people, let's say you're trying to sell him a laptop. You and I both have computers in front of us. And I go, okay, I'm going to sell you this laptop for $1,000. Well, Trump will go, instead of Trump going $950, he'll go fuck you. Pay me to take it. It's crap.
Yeah.
So that's where he starts. So then you go, wait a minute, what? He starts the negotiation so far away from where you are that you end up settling at $500 and you're happy about it. That's kind of his strategy. So if you think about the Canada as a 51st state thing, and then you think about, what Steve Bannon said about military alliance and preparing for maybe a third world war, you've only got a few years to put that in place. So realistically, acquiring Canada through any peaceful means would not happen in 2 to 3 years. It just couldn't possibly. There'd be a lot of global pushback, a lot of diplomatic issues. So that's not actually going to happen. But if he says, I'm going to take Canada, make it the 51st state, and everybody's up in arms, and then he goes, okay, here's a better idea, guys. We implement military. So we've got American military on Canadian soil. We'll drop all the tariffs. We'll make you a better trading partner. But we basically control, we have a strategic military alliance, and we'll give you some economic benefits so that you keep quiet. But now they basically have their military throughout our country, and most specifically in the northern section of Canada where the Arctic is. So you consider that, and everybody would go, well, that's not a bad idea. Yeah, okay, cool. And that taking what Trump does with his sort of approach to negotiating, Canada might actually take that and be happy about it. I think that's maybe more likely where it would land.
That is interesting, and actually something Sam Cooper's talked about coming from American law enforcement agencies as well, is that they want to be able to work within Canada.
Yes.
Like they're just like, hey, you guys are doing nothing about these Chinese narcos in your country. In fact, you guys are having them at your fundraisers.
Right.
So, that's one of the things that they're pushing for, is being like, if you guys aren't going to do anything about this, at least let us come up there and bust them.
And look what they're doing in Mexico.
Right.
They're already down there cracking down on the cartels.
Yeah.
And Mexico's letting them do it. They just said, hey, don't take this as an opportunity to diminish our independence. But yeah, you can come in and attack the cartels.
Right.
It's already happening.
So that is interesting in the sense where if you want to avoid the scenario of America becoming more and more antagonistic to Canada, this circle, allowing these people with these deep ties to China, is only going to ramp that up.
100%.
So you look at other people within his circle as well. Okay, Gerald Butts, Trudeau's top strategist and WEF insider. He was Trudeau's former principal secretary and architect of his policies. He's a key figure connecting Carney to Trudeau and Barton. He works alongside Carney's wife, Diana Fox Carney, in consultancy roles. That's the same one whose sister is also listed in Epstein's files. Expected to play a major role in Carney's campaign and potential administration. Butts was the one that fell on the sword for the SNC Lavalin scandal, right? Where they pushed the Jody Wilson Raybould in order to try to give a deferral to SNC Lavalin to avoid criminal charges for corruption, which would allow them to still get the federal contracts, which is really interesting because they just received another major one actually since then, which was the whole $3.5 billion rail that Trudeau announced he wants to build from Montreal to Toronto. That they're one of the companies involved in that, but SNC Lavalin, now rebranded, is getting some of that money,
of course,
which is crazy. But okay, why that to me is nuts, where you can go, okay, Gerald Butts falls on the sword for Trudeau in that whole SNC Lavalin scandal. But then Carney, who's again within this circle of power brokers, swaps out Trudeau, and then what? Butts is now able to come back, and that's not a major scandal?
Well,
that he can just be like, it's like, okay, if you had to step down because you were so unethical and you were trying to force people to circumvent the law,
for sure,
then like what? Now you get a clean slate because it's Carney instead of Trudeau?
This is the Mickey Mouse nonsense of Canadian politics, though, right?
Yeah.
And you look at Butts and you go, okay, WEF insiders. So now we're talking about more post-national globalism, our global agenda, rather, I should say. And you look at his connection with Carney's wife, which is a complete climate zealot. So then you just consider the landscape that he's operating within and what he's going to be pushing when he gets here.
Yeah. Another person, Mark Wiseman, the financial power broker and WEF advocate. He was the former head of Canada's Pension Plan Investment Board, and he was a BlackRock executive.
The CPP is the biggest racket in history.
For sure.
Okay.
Same page. And then he co-founded the Century Initiative, which was the whole plan to reach 100 million population by 2100. and he supports all of the WEF policies on climate and mitigation.
So the significant things there really are that you're going to continue to see massive immigration into the country if that initiative is still alive and well, and then the CPP is going to continue robbing Canadians blind.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
This is the most concerning person that I see within Carney's circle is Jin LeQuinn.
Jin
don't
LeQuinn.
know if I'm saying that properly.
Probably not, but I like it.
But anyways, he leads the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, a financial arm of China's Belt and Road Initiative. So this is, again, just very similar to the USAID's whole situation. This is like China's version of it. However, he was a former Red Guard in Chinese Communist Party insider. And so when you look at what a Red Guard is, and so according to a Red Guard leader, the movement's aims were as follows. Chairman Mao has defined our future as an armed revolutionary youth organization. So if Chairman Mao is our Red Commander-in-Chief and we are his Red Guards, who can stop us? First, we will make China Maoist from the inside out, and then we will help the working people of other countries make the world red, and then the whole universe, right? So red is often
very
means
ambitious.
communism. Yeah, we're going to make the whole world communist.
No.
Or sorry, the whole universe.
universe.
Right. These are the people that are on the inside with Carney.
Well, the problem you have here is pretty significant. You know, you go back to sort of the Chinese infiltration within Canada. And what's interesting right now is because of the push back against China from Trump in inadvertent ways, but it's happening, even with the relationship with Russia, like that is anti-China move, right? That is to isolate China. They're just going to be more emboldened to expand their reach because they're under attack, essentially. So when you see things like this within the upper ranks of Canada, this is more concerning. Even though the result of how they infiltrated Trudeau's cabinet in our elections was very significant and it was a real problem for Canada, now they're very, very motivated to not only be here, but put their foot on the gas and throw more gasoline on the fire because they're losing ground to the Americans. So they're going to be trying a lot harder, and people like this are going to be instrumental in their effort to expand their reach.
Yeah, and I think what's scariest about that front is like, man, they're so good at subversion. The communists, whether it be the Chinese Communist Party or the Soviets, were fantastic at this as well. This idea of, you know, this is what Yuri Bezmenov pointed out, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where they just infiltrated. He's like, we're not playing the immediate force game. We're ideologically subverting you guys into communism, and this is a 40, 50-year plan we have. Very similar to what China laid out there as well. But I think this is what the world is waking up to, and Trump's actually putting it into action, which is that in the 90s, when America welcomed China into the global fold and started doing trade relations with them and such, instead of viewing them as an enemy, everyone's idea in that was, okay, well, if we allow China into the fold, they're going to become more like us. And that's the exact opposite of what happened.
That's arrogance and ego.
It's kind of like
silly.
It's kind of like when you let your immune system down in a sense, and it's like, oh, they just got into you, like they literally infiltrated, and they're from the inside out, they're actually completely changing you.
Well, the what they didn't realize or failed to realize was that this is a cultural war. That as soon as the Cold War was over and they thought they won, the cultural war continued on the other end, and now they're starting to kind of win. Right. China and Russia and those strategies like you're talking about with Yuri Bezmenov, that stuff it is alive and well and thriving in our communities right now. Mm-hmm. It's just such a big error. But yeah, I agree.
All right, last story for the day. The cold logic of power, Machiavelli on fear versus love. So Niccolo Machiavelli was born in 1469 and lived until 1527. He was an Italian political philosopher, historian, and diplomat, best known for The Prince, which was his book, a ruthless guide to power and statecraft. A realist, he argued that rulers must prioritize pragmatism over morality, using fear, deception, and manipulation when necessary to maintain control. His ideas remain influential in politics today. So I pulled this quote from The Prince, which is very interesting. He says, "It is much safer to be feared than loved, if one must choose, because men are generally ungrateful, fickle, false, cowardly, and greedy. As long as you serve their interests, they are devoted to you. But when you are in danger, they turn against you. Since love is held by a bond of obligation, which is broken whenever it serves their purpose, fear is maintained by a dread of punishment, which never fails. So, is it ethical for a ruler to derive their authority from fear over love, or is there a third option? And if so, how does it compare to Machiavelli's framework?
So I took a minute just to write something about this because it was just kind of a new idea for me because I didn't really explore this much. So here's what I sort of came up with. Machiavelli's assertion that it's safer for rulers to be feared than loved comes from a pragmatic perspective, grounded in the idea that human nature is inherently self-interested and unreliable. In his view, fear is more stable than love because it doesn't rely on the fickle nature of affection. It depends on the threat of consequences. However, from an ethical standpoint, ruling through fear raises significant moral concerns, as it often involves manipulation, oppression, and the undermining of individual freedoms. A ruler who uses fear risks fostering an environment of resentment and unrest, which could ultimately destabilize their rule, which generally it always does. Now, in terms of a third option, I thought that respect could serve as a viable alternative to fear or love. While respect can be built on trust, fairness, and ethical leadership, it also requires strength, wisdom, and genuine moral authority. Unlike love, which can be fleeting, or fear, which can breed hatred, respect can create a more sustainable and ethical relationship between a ruler and their people. It's not about controlling or coercing the populace, but about leading by example, fostering loyalty through actions, and making decisions that benefit society.
Yeah, that's good. Actually, we both ended in the same spot because I do believe there is a third option that he didn't consider, which is respect. And I think there's an element of fear to respect. The way that I'd look at it from, say, for instance, like a father that you respect, you do know that there's discipline if you step out of line. Like that's kind of the father's role, to be the disciplinary figure. But it's where that is coming from. So it's like, is that coming from cruelty, or is that coming from genuine want for betterment?
Almost like, is it coming from the perspective of love, or is it coming from the perspective of fear?
Right.
Yes.
And two, I actually think a great example of this is because the reason that this was on my mind is especially this whole Machiavelli thing is, again, because of, say, for instance, the Freedom Convoy Emergencies Act, and looking at that and going like, yeah, I think that was an attempt to fear. Actually, what's really interesting as well is in that chapter from The Prince, where I pulled this excerpt from, one thing that he also talks about is making sure that hatred, you cannot be hated as a leader. Like, fear is okay. Like, it's okay to be feared, but if it comes from a place of cruelty and they actually feel like you drive hatred within the population towards you, that's when you start getting rebellion.
Yes.
And so you look at, I don't think there's a more hated man in recent Canadian history than Justin
I'm
Trudeau.
not sure there is a more hated man in Canadian history at all.
So it backfired hard on him for sure. But I think a great example of this is the famous Alexander the Great speech. So there was a point when they were conquered. Alexander the Great was the emperor, essentially. I don't know if he ever gave himself that title, but he was the leader of the Macedonian Empire. And he, at one point, when they were conquering and they were in Persia, he started very much intertwining himself with the cultures that they conquered. So, for instance, he would start wearing Persian garb and stuff like that. And his armies started turning on him and having a mutiny because they were like, this is disloyal, this is like traitorous kind of vibes is what was coming from his people. And then he gave like a 7-minute speech and pretty much said, he opened it by going, if you want to leave, go ahead, like I'm not going to stop you. But then essentially just laid out his track record for the previous 10 years. And he's like, look at what we've done together. Like, look at what you and I have accomplished together. And actually, one thing as well is that he was there was a great line in that, is he was like, I would argue that any one of you, this isn't verbatim, but he's like, I would argue that any one of you could come up here and show me the scars that you've suffered in battle, and I have more. And kind of being like, I've been at the front lines of this with you. You guys aren't my slaves. You guys aren't, we do this because we have a lot of honor.
We're unified. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so, he got them back through respect. And so he had thousands of men wanting to mutiny and just leave the conquest that they were on and go back home. And it was just by him being like, this is my resume, that got them to stay. And they were like completely on board and they came back. And so it's like, that's respect. That's getting them through respect, which is going to have way more loyalty than fear or love, I think.
I just think a lot of people can't rule that way because it's hard to get people to respect you because it comes with a lot of work. You
Right.
don't just get to be the ruler that sits in an ivory tower that is creating rules for everyone else but yourself. You have to lead by example. You have to be willing and capable of doing what the others are doing. So I think it's the best methodology, but I think you have to have a certain character that's capable of actually filling those shoes. And I don't think most people can do it.
All right, don't forget to head over to our Substack where you can find our newsletter, which goes out 5 days a week. You can sign up for completely free. And if you are able to help out and support the podcast and Blendr News as a whole and sign up for a paid subscription, that would be greatly appreciated as well. All right, thanks for watching, and we'll catch you next time.
Bye, everybody.